Hi, welcome back to Busch History. This presentation is going to be about the United States Constitution and about some of the details contained within and some of the compromises necessary to get it passed. Now, if you remember from previous discussions, the Articles of Confederation had been the plan that we have been operating under actually since 1776, since the ratification of the Declaration of Independence. It had not been ratified until the war was over, but we were operating under its basic tenets during the war. We needed a government, we needed a way for supplies to be procured, we needed a way to handle our military, so that was the Articles of Confederation. And it was a league of friendship. It was a friendship between the various states, and the common goal was to defeat the British. So then the war comes to an end in 1781 with the defeat at Yorktown, and then we have the peace treaty in 1783, and we still have the Articles of Confederation. And the question is, will the Articles of Confederation work in peacetime the way it worked in wartime? Can you get a league of friendship to govern a nation? Remember, these colonies had different beginnings, and because they had different beginnings, they had different goals and different lifestyles and different outlooks. And would they come together and share equally under this Articles of Confederation where most things were voluntary? Would the finances work? We know the finances didn't work when the war ended. The states were printing their own money. Taxation was voluntary. The idea of participating in the army was voluntary. States could make their own trade agreements with European powers as opposed to trade agreements by a central government. Amendments to the Articles of Confederation, changes, had to be unanimous. This document, this set of documents, because that's really what it was a set of documents put together, hence the Articles of Confederation, was really based on the idea that everyone is going to behave well and play well in the sandbox. So historians have given this time period two different names. Some people call it the critical period. Will the United States make it or not? And that is often the dominant term used. And some people call it the decade of crisis, meaning the 1780s. In either case, the Articles of Confederation is not longed for existence as a document that's going to govern the United States because it frankly is too weak. The states can do what they want. It relies on everyone to get along, and everyone doesn't always get along. We need some kind of coercive power in our government, and the Articles of Confederation lacked that coercive power. So we're going to take a look at that right now. So let me cue up this PowerPoint. I'll be right back with you. This presentation on the Constitution is not directly connected to any particular textbook. It is a broad outlook on the United States Constitution. So I'm going to go through this slide by slide and talk about it as necessary. So here we go. Let's take a look. This critical period, as I mentioned a little earlier, is 1781 to 1789. It deals with the time period from when the war ends to when the Constitution is actually put in play. The Articles of Confederation had been what we've been marching under. It assumed that the states would behave themselves to be able to get along. Well, when there's a common enemy, as during the Revolutionary War, that's probable. But after the war was over, the states were going to go back to their own divergent interests, and that would mean there would be arguments and debate and discussion, and there was no central authority to settle those. The new government, the Articles of Confederation government, lacked any kind of coercive authority, and the states were not willing to give up any power to it. So let's take a quick look. The Articles of Confederation proposed in 1776 and formally adopted in 1781, and that's only because the idea of getting together the Continental Congress during the war to debate the Articles of Confederation was kind of pointless. So we used it, but it wasn't adopted or ratified until 1781. And if you take a look, which branch is responsible for enforcing laws and judging lawbreakers? There was none. It didn't exist. How would trade between states be conducted? That wasn't handled either. And what if a state decided to act independently? That wasn't handled. Let's take a look. The Articles, legislative branch. Congress is made up of one house, and any state can send any number of representatives to that house, but each state had only one vote. So you can send 300 representatives to debate in the legislative branch, in Congress, and you still get only one vote. You needed 9 or 13 states to approve a law. That's a supermajority because half plus 1 of 13 is 7. It's kind of like our present-day Senate, and it was largely dysfunctional for that. for that reason. There was no executive branch, which means there was no one in charge. There was an executive council. There was no judicial branch, so there was no one to enforce any of the laws. Only states could tax, so there was no federal taxation, which meant no support for any kind of army. Each state could print its own money, a very bad idea, because whose money would be worth more? From going from New York to New Jersey to Connecticut, you would have to actually change money. And can you imagine that? Whose money would be worth more? And those arguments were probably huge in number and occurrence. And the states could act independently from each other, as well as trading with other states and nations. It was all private deals, all deals between the states. And obviously it was going to get confusing and it was going to be a problem. So we're going to have a test. A little background before we get to Shay's Rebellion. In 1785, there had been the Annapolis Convention, a group of nationalists who wanted a strong national government led by people like Alexander Hamilton, wanted to have a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland in 1785. Well, they want to meet there to revise the Articles of Confederation and have a stronger national government. Well, for the most part, most of the states were happy with the way things are going, so most people didn't show up. So it was a useless convention at Annapolis in 1785. We need an event. We need an event to fuel people. And that event is going to be in 1786 with Shay's Rebellion. Daniel Shay was simply a taxpayer in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts legislature voted to have this incredibly heavy tax. And they were going to tax the poorest of the people, which is not at all unusual in history. And they only wanted payment in gold or silver, which is kind of strange because the Massachusetts government was printing a paper money as the rest of the colonies or the now new states were, but they'd only accept gold and silver in return when they were getting their tax payments. And of course, many people didn't have gold or silver. So Daniel Shay leads this huge rebellion, a statewide rebellion that goes on for a long period of time, a whole bunch of months, better part of a year actually. And Massachusetts turns around and they ask the national government to help. We have to put down this rebellion. We have to stop these people. We need our tax dollars. But the national government didn't have that kind of ability. First of all, there isn't an army, really. There isn't a standing army because there's no way to support it. And they don't have coercive power. So the nationalists, those people who had been in Annapolis a year before, use Shay's Rebellion as an example of what happens when things go wrong. And that's going to lead to the Continental Congress reconvening and realizing we have to do something about this. We need a way to force the states to behave. We need a way to put down these rebellions. We need to revisit the Articles of Confederation. So the Second Continental Congress is going to reconvene. And they're going to reconvene with an idea of altering the Articles of Confederation. So they reconvene and they want to get together and they want to solve the problems in the Articles of Confederation. This is May of 1787, and Shay's Rebellion showed them that they needed something stronger, that we needed a stronger national government. And now here's the question. Do we get liberty or order? Because if we're going to institute a stronger national government, that means we're going to have more laws. Laws on taxation, laws on agreements between states, laws on international treaties, and people obviously giving up a bit of freedom. So do we go for freedom, which is what we have under Shay's Rebellion, or do we go for order and organization, which is what we're going to get if we alter the Articles and ultimately end up with a Constitution? Can you have too much freedom? Was the Articles of Confederation the necessary mistake, as some historians call it? Was it necessary to prove to people that they could indeed have too much freedom and they needed to give up some of that freedom and have some control by some kind of coercive central authority and unify and accept the power of a stronger national government? That is the debate. Now, we all know how that ends up. So the idea that you can have too much freedom really does exist. And under the Articles of Confederation, too much freedom was what was going on. So how could we keep a semblance of freedom under this new plan? So who was right? Now, nationalists wanted a strong national government, but they didn't know exactly how that national government would occur. Federalists, they had the plan for that national government. So a federalist was a nationalist, but a nationalist was not necessarily a federalist, as you'll see shortly. So the Federalists believed that too much liberty meant chaos. And they meant that organization, and they thought that organization was good for the common people, and that organization was paramount for our goals as a nation. And they were mostly wealthy lawyers and businessmen, anti-federalists. Now, they actually came to be called Jeffersonians, by the way. They were called anti-federalists by the Federalists. They feared a strong central government. They said, you know, if we have this strong central government, we're going to lose a lot of our freedom and a lot of our independence, what we had just fought for. And that certainly is true, too. So they claimed that a strong government would take away their liberty, that individual rights were more important than organization and control, and that people would behave themselves. So they included farmers, laborers, and some politicians. They were the majority. So the majority were anti-federalists, the minority were federalists. And remember, nationalists believed in a strong central government. Federalists had the plan for that strong central government. So that's going to be the debate. And the Federalists, they're going to have to find some way to win over the anti-federalists for this to work. They need a plan. And their plan is going to have three main compromises. And these compromises have come to be known as the Great Compromise, and I'll go over that in a minute, the Three-Fifths Compromise, which will follow, and the Slavery Compromise, which will follow that. So let's take a look. The Great Compromise, this idea of representation. Well, we have big states and we have small states. Big meaning the amount of people, large in population. Size has nothing to do with this debate, although it will fit into the mechanics later on. So, New Jersey, the New Jersey plan calls for a unicameral legislature with every state receiving the same amount of votes. The Virginia plan calls for a unicameral legislature with every state receiving a proportional amount of votes, meaning that the larger states get more votes and the smaller states get less votes. So the Virginia plan benefits the larger states, and the New Jersey plan benefits small states. So if you read the writing on the wall, there's a compromise to be had here. And the compromise is going to be this idea of a bicameral legislature. Bi meaning two. Bicycle, for example, biplane, binomial, they all mean two. So now we're going to have this bicameral legislature. We're going to have the House of Representatives, which is based on the Virginia plan, where states are going to get proportionate representation, meaning they will have an amount of representations based on their population. Then we're going to get the Senate, where each state sends 2 representatives, and that's based on the New Jersey plan. So as you can see, the House favors the large states, and the Senate favors the small states. So what have we really done here? Well, the compromise is, in order to get any law passed and submitted to the executive branch, which will follow, both houses have got to agree. A law can begin in either the House of Representatives as a bill or in the Senate as a bill, but in order to actually become a law, they both have got to agree on a compromise of their differing ideas, and that's what gets sent off to the president. So that is the Great Compromise. Now, as you can see then, representation matters. The amount of representatives each state has in the House of Representatives is crucial, because you can still get a state that controls the House of Representatives or that has more votes in the House of Representatives than another state if it can find a way to increase its population. States with a greater population have more representatives. It won't affect the Senate, but it will affect the House of Representatives. So how does this play out? Well, the southern states want to count their slaves, because if Virginia and South Carolina and North Carolina and Georgia can count their slaves, then they can increase their representation in the House of Representatives. Obviously, the northern states don't like that idea, because it really would allow the southern states, with their tremendous population of slaves, millions of slaves at this point, to control the House of Representatives. So the northern states say, no, we're not doing that, we're not doing that. So what they come up with is an interesting compromise. It's called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And it's modern math. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 counts as 3. Well, how could that be? Well, it meant every group of 5 slaves would count as 3 white people for representation. So 5 meant 3, and they could count those groups of 3, and each time you got a given number of 3s, you get an additional representative. It's a little hokey, yes, but in order to pass this Constitution, or this plan, you needed the Southern votes. Most of the Anti-Federalists were in the South. They were mostly farmers, and they did not want to give up their slaves. Of course, Thomas Jefferson is having a fit because he wants slavery to end. Remember, he wanted it in the Declaration of Independence, and he certainly does not, he wanted slavery to end in the Declaration of Independence, and he certainly does not want slavery in the Constitution. But, strangely enough, Thomas Jefferson is not there. He's not at this debate. So Southerners wanted to count slaves toward representation in Congress. Northerners realized that this would allow the South to dominate Congress. They argued that slaves were not free and cannot be counted. How do you count people who don't have any freedom? They don't vote, but you're going to count them? It doesn't make a lot of sense to the Northerners. The South said, listen, you want our support, you have to give us some way to count our slaves. So the compromise was reached. Every 5 slaves would be counted as the equivalent of 3 white men for the purpose of representation. Now, if you're good at this, if you figure out how to game this, that means if the South can get a lot of slaves, they can still dominate the House of Representatives. So it's not a great compromise, and that compromise right there is going to be the seed that's going to lead to the Civil War. Then you're going to get the slavery compromise. Well, if the 3/5 compromise was going to benefit the South, the slavery compromise is going to benefit the North, because the South's going to try to import lots of slaves. And if they're going to try to import lots of slaves, they're going to dominate the House of Representatives. So the way the slavery compromise works is an intent to limit that. So the South could control Congress simply by importing more slaves. A limit on the importation of slaves was agreed upon. Slaves could only be imported until 1808. There could be no international slave trade dealing with the United States after 1808. So you have 20 years. 20 years, the South can import slaves, and yeah, they would import a lot of slaves in that 20 years. And what the North would also get out of this was a tax of $10, which was a good deal of money, it was about $1,000 back in those days, would be placed on each of these transactions. So it would put money into the national treasury each time the South imported a slave. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution, not because it was all his idea, but because he writes it. He had great handwriting. He was a Federalist. He believed in the federal plan. So he, along with John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, would be the principals in writing this Constitution. But he is largely given credit, known as the father of the Constitution. He was well educated, he was well liked, and he was an easy guy to get along with. So that was important. Here are the basic principles of the Constitution. Popular sovereignty. The power of the federal government would be limited over the states. States would have a limited amount of self-determination, which would go to a limited government. That we'd have this national government that states would still be able to make their own laws and rules and regulations. This idea of federalism, a division of power between national governments and the states. For example, whereas there would be national laws, such as a national currency and a national army, and trade relationships between the United States and other countries would be negotiated by the national government, states can still make their own laws. They can make laws about internal taxes. They can make laws about how business would be conducted within the states. Later on, they would make all kinds of laws about marriage. Today, we have different driver's license laws, and we have different laws about, for example, same-sex marriage. Those are all parts of federalism. Building codes, another example. Building regulations in Hawaii, Alaska, Florida, and New York are all different because they have different climates. So federalism is a division of power with the federal government having the final say, but states being able to make their own rules and regulations. This idea, once again, of limited government and popular sovereignty. There would be a 3-branch system, a separation of powers. We have 3 branches in the United States government. The legislative branch, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, also known as Congress. They make the laws. So they turn around and they debate and argue, and when they come up with a final bill, a compromise bill is often called, they send it off to the president at the executive branch. He heads the executive branch. That's the second of the 3 branches. Article 1 in the Constitution is the legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive branch. The executive branch, as it implies, is the business part of the government. The president looks at the law and says, okay, do I like this law? He signs it. Then he hands it off to the various departments in the executive branch to make sure that law is indeed instituted. Or he doesn't like the law and he vetoes it. Veto! And he sends it back to the House of Representatives or the Senate, wherever it originally began, and said, guys, I don't like it. If you want me to consider a law like this, do it again. Very often they will not. Sometimes they will, and they can override that presidential veto. That's part of what's called checks and balances. But nevertheless, the executive branch is the business part that makes sure that these laws indeed do get instituted. And then we're going to have the judicial branch, which is Article 3 in the Constitution. The judicial branch is where the laws are judged. Should someone question a law, the Supreme Court will decide, is that law constitutional or not constitutional? In other words, does it go along philosophically with the ideas and the basis of the United States Constitution? So that's the three-branch theory, and that's part of separation of powers. And finally, checks and balances. The idea that one branch can be checked, the power can be controlled by another branch. For example, if the legislative branch passes a bill along to the president that the bill does not like. Suppose they pass a bill, for example, it's been a hot topic, gay marriage, or a bill about national health care. If the president doesn't like these bills, he can simply veto them. So there's a check on the executive, from the executive branch onto the legislative branch. However, if the legislative branch disagrees with the president, with a 2/3 majority in both houses, they can override the president's veto. So there's a check on the president's power. The president appoints judges to the Supreme Court, but they have to go through the Senate Judiciary Committee to be actually approved. Well, the Senate Judiciary can check the president's power by turning around and saying, no, we don't like this guy, and that's happened several times in American history. And then you get the judicial branch. The legislative branch has passed a law, the executive branch has signed the law and put it into effect, and the judicial branch says, no, not so fast. This law is unconstitutional, or this law is constitutional. A recent debate about what's called Obamacare, this idea of national health care requiring the states to participate, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld President Obama's national health care plan under the idea that it was a tax. That it was a tax on the states, and the federal government has the ability to tax. So there's another check. The judicial branch checked, not the executive branch, but checked the legislative branch in this particular case, and said, no, you can turn around and you can have this. So that's the idea of checks and balances. This idea of separation of powers, I mentioned a few minutes ago. Powers are divided between the three branches. The legislative branch makes the laws, aka Congress. The executive branch enacts the laws. The president is known as the chief executive because he leads the executive branch. And we have the judicial branch interprets the laws. They decide whether the law is constitutional or unconstitutional. Some famous ones. The Roe case, in which abortion was essentially declared to be legal in the United States under the right to privacy. The Brown case, Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, in which segregation was outlawed. Two right there. Dred Scott, going all the way back to 1857, where Dred Scott sued for his freedom because he had been taken into free territory, and the Supreme Court said, that might be true, but you're not a person, you're a slave, and thereby you can't bring suit before the Supreme Court. So, Supreme Court gets involved in a lot of controversial things. The grandfather of all cases in Marbury versus Madison in 1803, where the Supreme Court, under John Marshall, has to rule whether William Marbury will indeed get his appointment from John Adams. And they ultimately rule, so John Marshall actually gets to rule on his own mistake. He ultimately rules that the Supreme Court does not have original jurisdiction, and that William Marbury goes to the wrong court, and that elements of the Judiciary Act of 1789 are unconstitutional because it gave the president power to appoint unlimited judges. So that's the Marbury versus Madison case. So the judicial branch, very, very important. Give you an idea of what the three branches can do. The legislative branch, they can pass laws, they can override a president's veto, as we talked about, they can approve treaties. Whenever the president signs a treaty with another nation, they have to approve those treaties. Famous treaties not approved, the Treaty of Versailles during Woodrow Wilson's administration after World War I. They can impeach the president. Only two presidents in the United States history have ever been impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. In both of these cases, they were impeached, and that meant the House of Representatives said that there was enough evidence to put the president on trial for a crime against the United States, and then the Senate would try him. In both cases, with President Clinton and with President Andrew Johnson, they were acquitted in the Senate. So impeachment means put on trial. It does not mean losing your job, which a lot of people think it does. Anyway, they also create lower federal courts. They can decide how money will be spent. They can print money. They can support and raise the military. So that is the job of Congress. They can declare war. The president cannot declare war. When the president wants to go to war, he goes to Congress and he asks for their approval, and they turn around and they say, yes, we approve and we will fund your war. and they can regulate foreign and interstate trade. That means trade between the states. Then we get the executive branch. They carry out the laws that Congress has passed. They can also propose laws. Specifically, the president can propose a law to Congress for debate. He can veto laws. He can negotiate foreign treaties. Nowadays, it's largely done by the Secretary of State with some input from the President. The President still oversees our foreign policy, but the Secretary of State is the person who is really doing most of the negotiating. He is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He can appoint judges, ambassadors, and other high officials, and he can grant pardons. It is not unusual for the President at the end of his tenure in office, in what's called the lame duck period, the period after the election and before the new President takes office, to grant pardons to a number of federal offenders. Can be very controversial when that occurs. And the Supreme Court, you notice, has the fewest defined attributes. They really declare laws unconstitutional, and they can declare executive actions unconstitutional, meaning executive by the executive branch. Checks and balances is the idea. This is what the Anti-Federalists, one of the things they wanted to make sure was put into this Constitution if they were going to vote for it. How do we control these three branches? So no one branch is allowed to become too powerful. Each branch can check the power of another branch. Power is equally distributed between the branches, and it prevents a dictatorship. So this gives you an idea how the three branches interact, as I said a few minutes ago. The executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Take a quick look. So the President carries out laws, but Congress proposes those laws, can veto the laws, and the checks on the judicial branch, the President appoints those judges, and the legislative branch has to actually have hearings to discuss what's going on, and do we like this judge, do we not, does he have what we want? The legislative branch makes laws, and the checks on the executive branch. They can override the President's veto, they can confirm his appointments or deny his appointments. They ratify treaties, or they can impeach him. Their checks on the judicial branch is that they create the lower federal courts. So they create the courts that look at the laws before they go on to the judicial branch. They can impeach federal judges, so they can turn around and control the judicial branch in that way. And finally, the judicial branch, they can check the executive branch by declaring the President's actions unconstitutional, or they can check the legislative branch by determining that acts by the legislative branch, laws, are unconstitutional. So it's kind of like a spider's web, and they all interact with each other. So what is federalism? Federalism, briefly stated, is a strong central government that has power over the states, and the states are subordinate to that central government, but they have powers that are reserved to them that are unique from the central government, from the federal government. So federalism is a power-sharing plan between the strong national government and the subordinate state governments. So you could be a nationalist, meaning you want a strong national government, but you don't agree with the federal plan, so you're not a federalist. If you're a federalist, you believe in a strong national government, and you believe in a division of powers and subordinate state governments. So, what is federalism? National federal government shares power with each of the levels below. They share power with the state governments, and they deal with disputes between the states. The state government, they share power with other levels and deal primarily with state matters. County governments, town governments. Think about it, for example. If you're in a typical high school, and the high school is a parking lot, and you're a student and you're parking in that parking lot, you are subject to the laws, rules, and regulations passed by the school board when you're in that parking lot. However, if you drive out of the parking lot and you make a turn, and you're now in a village, well, you're subject to those village laws and the village speed limit. So now you're driving outside the village, and you enter into the town. Now you're subject to the town laws and the town speed limits, typically higher than the village speed limit. So now you're going to go down that town road, and you're going to get onto a federal interstate highway. Interstate 80, Interstate 95, Interstate 84, Interstate 78, it doesn't matter. You're going to be subject to federal laws while you're on those interstates. Now, each time those interstates pass through a local town, you might be subject to the local town laws. That's the whole idea of federalism. It's a power-sharing idea that gives a good deal of power to the states. In modern times, state laws include driving regulations, the age you can get your driver's license, for example, marriage laws, the age you can marry, the age of consent, which is what age is sexual relations, mostly 17 years old throughout the United States. The drinking age varies state by state, although most states, in fact I think all states these days adhere to the 21-year-old drinking law, but that is not a federal law. The states simply go along with it because the federal government said if you don't have a 21-year-old drinking age, we will withhold federal highway funds. So if you want funds to repair your roads, we need you to have a 21-year-old drinking age. It does make sense that there be uniformity with drinking ages. Building codes vary by the state because climate is different in different states. States that are landlocked do not need a lot of laws about their ports, which might be handled by a local jurisdiction. So it varies a lot, and that's the whole idea behind federalism. And that takes us to the Electoral College. If you notice, states have different numbers. The Electoral College is ultimately who chooses the President of the United States, and they meet in December of the election year. Election day is in November, and the Electoral College meets in December. Each state has a given number of electors, and those electors are based on the state's population. They have an elector for each of their representatives to the combined Senate and the House of Representatives, meaning every state has 2 senators. So you get a representative in the Electoral College, an elector for each of those senators. And every state has a minimum of 1 representative based on its population. So the minimum amount of electors any state can have is 3. Take a look, for example, out here in Montana and Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, relatively not that densely populated states, relatively low population, but they have 2 senators. So you get a representative for each of their senators. And they have 1 representative to the House of Representatives. So you get a representative based on that. So you have 3 electors. 1 for each senator and 1 for their representative to the House of Representatives. Whereas New York or Florida, for example, gets many more, and California has the most at 54. That's a lot. That's a lot. That means they have the largest population. So yes, more populated states can still control the election of the president, but 270 electors are needed to elect the president on election night. So what happens is you can get a candidate with 268, and then 268 electors coming in based on the returns of each state and the electors from each state. And all of a sudden North Dakota comes in with 3, and those 3 votes become significant because they will make the next president of the United States. There's been a big debate about getting rid of the Electoral College, that in modern society, with the ability to transfer information quickly over the internet, that it should all be by popular vote, that the president should be elected through popular vote. There is an argument to be had there that it should be the person with the majority of popular votes wins the presidency. For example, in the 2000 election between George Bush and Al Gore had more popular votes, but George Bush still became the president because he had more electoral votes. There's an argument to be had for that, but the other argument is, if you do away with the Electoral College, you really make states with low populations like Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota insignificant in the electoral process. So it's not likely to happen because they want to maintain their status as a player in the process in one way or another. Amending the Constitution, Article 5. Remember, the Constitution made up a series of articles. And Article 5 has to do with amending the Constitution, formally changing it. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, it had to be unanimous, which meant nothing was happening in terms of changing the Articles of Confederation. So here it goes. To propose an amendment to the Constitution, you need 2/3 of each House of Congress. That's a significant number. It's a supermajority in each case. And a convention is called by 2/3 of the state legislature to review what Congress wants. To ratify the amendments, you need 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's a lot of states that got to go along with this, or 3/4 of special conventions held in each state, which is pretty synonymous to 3/4 of state legislatures. So amending the Constitution is tough, but it can be done. It has to be a preponderance of opinion in the United States and in government that amending the Constitution is necessary. So what do we know? What is federalism? Federalism is a power-sharing system between the state and federal government, and the states would have a certain degree of autonomy on local laws, but laws dealing with interstate items would be controlled by the federal government, and in disputes the federal government would have the final say. They have coercive power, and in laws that deal with the nation as a whole, the federal government has the final say. The Great Compromise was necessary in order to get the slave-holding states to go along, and in order to get the anti-federalists to go along, because it did not allow for domination by more populated states over lesser populated states. The Great Compromise made from the New Jersey and the Virginia plans, the Senate being based on the New Jersey plan, the House of Representatives being based on the Virginia plan, and the Senate and the House must agree before a bill can be sent to the President's desk to be signed. The specific duties of the three branches. Legislative branch makes laws, in a nutshell. Executive branch enacts those laws. Judicial branch interprets the laws. Yes, there's more to it, but that was covered earlier. What is the fewest number of electors any state can have? That would be 3. 1 for each senator, and 1 for 1 representative should their population call for only 1 representative. As their representatives increase in their population changes, those electors can change. Population shifts in the country cause that pattern to change. Few amendments. Why so few? It takes a lot. It takes a lot to get them done. That's kind of what it comes down to. And how many amendments are there? Look that one up. I want you to find that one out on your own. And part of the reason for not answering that, by the way, is I want this PowerPoint to be around for a while, and rather than give you a number that could change, I'd rather not give you a number. I'll give you a hint, though. It's not quite as many as you think it is. So, another thing I like to talk about, we talked about the Great Compromise and federalism. The group that did not want this federal system, they were called the Anti-Federalists, and they were followers of Thomas Jefferson and just Jeffersonian ideas about limited government. So a promise was made to the Anti-Federalists, and that promise was that their rights would be written down and protected forever. It's an incredible deal. It's an incredible deal. In exchange for getting the votes from the Anti-Federalists to support the Constitution and ratify the Constitution, they were given a promise by the Federalists. And that promise was the Bill of Rights. And the cool thing is, in 1791, 2 years after the Constitution took effect, the Anti-Federalists got their Bill of Rights. What a deal. So as you can see, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are really the basis for the modern political parties. No, you can't call one Democratic and one Republican, because there have been many changes along the way since then. But the differing points of view, the 2 dominant differing points of view, Federalists wanting a strong central government and the Anti-Federalists wanting a weaker government with states having more power, are really the basis for the 2 political parties that we have today. So, to finish the point, that deal between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists gave birth to the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and that is an incredible deal. Can you imagine the Republicans making a promise to the Democrats, or the Democrats making a promise to the Republicans, that if either one voted for the other point of view, that they would get something out of it as well that they also really wanted a lot. In this term, that was the Bill of Rights. So it's a pretty cool deal. It's one of my favorite stories in American history, that the Anti-Federalists or the Jeffersonians are promised a Bill of Rights by the Federalists in return for their vote to support the Constitution, and they get it. They actually get it. And that's a really cool thing. It shows that politicians can rise to the occasion from time to time. We wish it would happen more often, but it can happen. So in any case, this will also be posted on the Busch History website in the YouTube folder. You can take a look. It will be clearly labeled the United States Constitution. And that's it for now. So stay tuned for more updates. The next topic will deal with the early administrations of the United States and the forming of this new republic with Washington and Adams, and then going into Thomas Jefferson. So have a good day. Goodbye for now.